All right, welcome back then to Woodside Middle School again for Unit 5. And I'm still Mark, your facilitator and timekeeper. If you're good with it, like we did yesterday, we'll stick with the green for your 1-minute warning and the yellow background for your time's up warning. And other than that, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to the judges.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Tinder. I'm so glad you're back, and I'm glad that you're able to participate even though you're en route, right? We appreciate that. That's really nice. I'm an attorney who retired from the practice of law in Charleston, West Virginia, and I'm the West Virginia We the People coordinator. Lindsay?
Good morning. It's good to see you again. I'm Lindsay Draper. I am Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the Institute for Wellbeing in Law.
And I'm Candida Steele, retired as a federal judge in government contracts. Hi, good to see your faces again.
And can you reintroduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Yusuf Hamid.
My name is Marin Schaefer.
Smith, and this is our teacher, Mr. Howe.
Hi.
Thank you. All right. Surprise, surprise. We're doing question 2. Political and social movements in American history have been successful because of the right of assembly. President Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter that, quote, the right of peaceable assembly, end quote, is part of the, quote, constitutional substitute for revolution, end quote. Do you agree or disagree with President Lincoln? Why? What is the history of freedom of assembly in America? What historical or contemporary evidence is there, if any, that political and social movements have led to significant changes in laws or policies? What limits, if any, should be placed on the right of freedom of assembly? You may begin.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. The freedom to assemble was given to the citizens of the U.S. and is written in the Constitution in the First Amendment. Freedom of assembly was added to the First Amendment since it gives the citizens of the United States the right to gather and meet with one another. It also allows the U.S. citizens to speak out and advocate for things they would like to change, such as joining together and protesting. A big part of freedom of assembly is when women started to gather together and have their voices heard, just like men whose voices were mostly never unheard. There are also other situations such as Stonewall and Children's March. Abraham Lincoln was correct in saying that the right of peaceable assembly is part of the constitutional substitute for revolution. A modern example of Abraham Lincoln's words being true is in everyday life. People want to come together with each other, whether it be celebrating ethnicity or religion, whether it be a religious day or an ethnic day, and sometimes protest. But when you take people's freedom of assembly right away, that can cause a revolution. Found in Article 1, Section 8, the Free Exercise Clause states that the government cannot limit your right to practice beliefs. This means that the government can't take away your rights to assembly, since you would need to practice your beliefs with others, such as going to church to celebrate Easter Sunday. Isn't it somewhat okay to revolt if Congress takes away one of your rights? We saw revolting when Congress took away the right to drink alcohol and people got what they wanted. Or is it still harming the common good to stand up for something you think is right, such as bearing arms or drink alcohol?
I agree with President Lincoln. Freedom of assembly provides a way for change. The whole point of freedom of assembly is to allow social and political change, which allows us to perfect one system instead of recreating and destroying many. The Stonewall movement, a series of riots and protests, made way for gay rights in America. We can see that this worked as gay marriage is now legal. Another example of protest used for positive change is Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, during the Civil Rights Movement. The Southern Poverty Law Center labeled this city as the most racist town in America. Nearly 1,000 African American children skipped school and made their way into the city. All of these children were happily imprisoned, flooding the jails. Children went since they had nothing to lose for the cause of change. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, said Martin Luther King Jr., showing that it is part of the people's civic virtue to protest laws deemed unfair. Without the freedom of petition to change our government, we would rely on the inefficient route of voting officials who we think will decide for our common good.
Limits are tricky because, like anything else in our Constitution, they are meant to be left vague and open-ended. Many, if not all, of the assemblies and/or protests we mentioned stretch the limits of the right. I believe any more limits on our First Amendment right would be dangerous and unnecessary. I do not see any safe or cautious ways we could add any restrictions, since details such as location and time of day affect publicity. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. sums up the idea that direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. This is shown through Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, which held the first ever convention for women's rights, or as my colleague mentioned, Stonewall, which sparked the Pride movement. Seneca Falls remained very civilized, drafting a declaration of sentiments, while Stonewall was a series of violent riots. Both are considered successful. Martin Luther King Jr. has always been for people standing up against laws they felt were unjust. Limiting their rights should not be a concern of ours. What I take away from President Lincoln's quote about substituting revolution for legal protest is that the only way to protect a country from the people is to run a country for the people, and their ability to interact with the government is vital to that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
In DeYoung versus Oregon, the Supreme Court held that freedom of assembly was as important as freedom of speech. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I would agree with that statement, since they both have aspects that people can choose what they say and people can choose where they assemble. So in that perspective, I think it would be true.
But you can say what you're going to say without assembling. So why is it as important?
I feel I think that when people assemble with others, it makes it more enjoyable, and people, when such as Easter Sunday, as I said, it was a big deal that some states were putting restrictions on going to church because of COVID. And if they made such a big deal about not going to church, then why would it not be as important as freedom of speech?
Throughout our country, as we have talked about major marches on Washington have been huge in what we've done. Back in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan held two huge marches in Washington, I think 24 and 25. I'm talking like 25 to 30,000 people. How does that type of march play into advancing the ideas of the people? Some folks with some interesting ideas have the same right to march.
They do, because if the government were to stop them from marching, that would be the government telling you what you can or cannot hear. And that is indeed a very dangerous road. So even if the ideas are racist and extremely controversial, they still have their rights to march. And that's a good thing, because, well, their ideas aren't the good thing. Their right and ability to march is the good.
Okay. And the only thing that I would ask you to add to help me on is, and what if I were to say to you that the whole purpose of them marching was to try and intimidate? Would that change anything in your answer?
No. Like with the last question, where free speech is just as important as the ability to assemble. You can say what you want, and that's part of your rights, but having the actual action of assembling and gathering and petitioning is something completely different, and it gathers so much more publicity and cause for your change.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw on the news last night an interesting story that in Pittsburgh, I think it's Pittsburgh, they have locally issued new regulations about how the police can deal with protest, and they're not allowed to use rubber bullets or tear gas. What do you think of that? Do you think that should spread around the country?
I think that's a good thing, since often we see with the police regulating protests, they are causing a lot of harm. However, protests should be kept regulated somewhat so that it's not causing harm to your surroundings. There shouldn't be, you don't stop harm with more harm. That's not, well, you can, but that's not good. I believe that it's better to peacefully do really anything. And I do believe that the police should not be hurting people to stop them from protesting, because that is not only limiting their First Amendment, but it is also hurting them.
I agree with my colleague, but at the same time, if it's mainly up to the protesters to determine what happens, because if they let it get out of hand and it gets too violent, it starts to harm public order or public safety or people in general, then the police need to somehow step in and do something. Is violence the correct answer? I don't think so entirely, but if that's what it takes to get the situation calmed down, then that's what it takes.
Okay.
In looking at court cases in the past, what limits have been placed on assembly, and do you think that they were justified? Explain your answer. Can you think of any time that the courts have said it was okay to limit assembly? If not, tell me what limits could be placed on assembly that you think would be justified.
I think there should be limits on where you can assemble. For example, you shouldn't be assembling on highways because that can be dangerous to you and the people that you are surrounding, or the people who are around when you're protesting. I think, for example, another school, not another school, but a hypothetical example, if there were students in a school protesting, that should be allowed. However, if there's not someone who is allowed in the school, normally they should not be allowed. For example, my dad shouldn't go and protest in my school for one of his rights. That's not, they don't go together, and that's disrupting our learning. But if I wanted to protest in my school because of something in my school that I didn't like, that would be okay because I'm already supposed to be there. So there should be limits on where you're protesting, in my opinion.
Any other limits? Can you think of any that would be appropriate?
I also think there should be limits when you're directly causing harm to people, like on January 6th when they broke windows in the Capitol building. Also, the few riots during the BLM protests where they were smashing cars and burning buildings. Of course, we should limit destruction of property, and that's not fair at all. And even if we agree with the cause, we should be limiting if they're causing harm to their surroundings and people.
Thank you.
Just want to be sure that I heard something correctly. I thought earlier I heard from your statement, Congress took away the right to drink alcohol. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
How did Americans lose the right to have alcohol as part of their regular life?
People thought that alcohol was hurting the citizens, and then
Okay, we're going to
after
run out
that-
of time. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to cut you off. I'm not asking why, I'm asking how.
the overuse of drinking it.
The temperance movement in the early 1900s was what started that, and they wanted to ban the sale and production of alcohol. So they brought that upon themselves. It was an act of petition.
Great job. And obviously we wanted to keep talking. We hadn't finished our discussion, and that's always a sign of a good presentation, that we have more to discuss. And I know you had more to impart on us. Good job. I liked your 4-minute prepared statement as you went through some history and also gave us some constitutional underpinnings with Article 1, Section 8, and as you went through the history all the way through Seneca Falls and Alabama and all of that. I particularly liked our discussion in the Q&A part where you were able to discuss with us why it's important to have assembly, and it's a little bit different than speech. And that you recognize that those are two separate and distinct things, but they also overlap a lot because assembly is also speech. That you did a really good job bringing things back to the present when in answering the limits question. You talked about the January 6th events as well as Black Lives Matter. So you were cognizant of how those impact society, and parts of them maybe don't need any limits, but parts of them maybe do need some limits, and there might be a fine line between the two. So I think you did a really good job, and I appreciate our conversation today. Lindsay?
So as did I. Let me comment on a couple of things. One, I sort of have an expectation with this question that we'll talk about the women's movement and that we'll talk about the civil rights movement. Hadn't really expected to hear about Stonewall. I mean, that one it took me by surprise, I guess would be the way. I'm not quite sure that it was that movement that resulted in the same-sex marriage Supreme Court case, but it may have been, because it brought some conversations to the forefront. So you made me start thinking about some stuff. I liked the fact that you didn't quite use the word as often as you might have, but that peaceable assembly is what the Constitution guarantees and what's in the First Amendment. It's not that you can get together and you can protest, it's the peaceful. And if you stray from that, you run the risk of people missing what your message is, because that's what people are going to pay attention to. But more than that, you're not following what's constitutionally protected. And just sort of remember, there was a constitutional amendment that brought about prohibition. Congress had some stuff to say, but all of the states ratified a constitutional amendment. And then a few years later, after enough people said, you do know we want to drink, don't you? They unratified it. They ratified a getting rid of prohibition amendment. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you were able to talk about it. It's already been mentioned, Seneca Falls and the Declaration of Sentiment said you went beyond just knowing women's movement, Silent Sentinels, you did. So I really enjoyed it. And oh, I'm sorry, I do also want to mention, good job on pointing out that, yeah, I know the Klan marched, but we got to protect even the ideas we don't like. They have the right to peacefully assemble, peaceably assemble as well. So good job. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Candida, unmute.
Thank you. I also really appreciated your presentation. Stonewall, I thought, was an interesting thing to bring up, and the Children's March we could have heard a little more about, but that was really nice to bring up. I liked your moral responsibility to protest unlawful laws. And I think you did just a really lovely job. I hope you had fun, and I hope it was not too distracting, Yusef being in the car, because you did a fine job too. Thank you. You did a really great job. It was a pleasure to talk to all of you, and I hope you've enjoyed this experience, because we sure have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, team. And again, thanks, Mr. Half, for your hard work. Yusef, enjoy IU. Everybody have a great Sunday.